Excellent. So, hello everyone. I was about to say good evening, but what I can see is that we have participants from all over the world. So it's good morning for some of you, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the third seminar of this six-part continuing professional development seminar series. The CPD seminar series, as you know, is offered by the International Federation of Social Workers. Again, as some of you may know, this course was developed through collaboration between academics and researchers from countries that have or still do experience the impact of political conflict. The majority of presentations in the course are based on research, field research, also the lived experience of political conflicts, and presenters have included practitioners, academics, and again, people with lived experience of armed and political conflict, as well as health and social care services. This is the third session, the third seminar. In the first two, we focused on social work during the political conflict, and also with social work with displaced populations and work with refugees. Now, recordings of those sessions are already available, and you can find them on the seminar website. In the current session tonight, our focus really turns to what happens post-war. The emphasis is on post-war reconstruction and transitions to peace. We will have a number of three speakers across two main presentations. And the first presentation, the focus will be in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the second presentation will focus on Northern Ireland. We will introduce the speaker before the presentation, and now we'll hand over to my co-host, Sanela Basic from the University of Sarajevo. Sanela.
Thank you, Vasilios, for this wonderful introduction. It is really a pleasure and honor to be part of this seminar series. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all social work community throughout the world who is participating in this event. I will give some procedural information. By now, those who have been with us for the past 2 weeks, you might realize eventually that each seminar, including this one, has a unique following structure. There are two presenters or three presenters who will have the opportunity to present their research and their ideas, which will be followed by the brief question-answer session. Where you will have the opportunity to ask some immediately needed to be answered questions. And then at the end of all two presentations, we will have plenty of time for further discussions with our presenters. And they will be, I'm quite sure, very happy to answer all your questions regarding the topic that they have presented. So we would like to highly encourage our participants, all participants, to attend all 6 sessions, which take place Tuesdays in this British context from 5:30 to 6:45. Of which the last one will take place on the 3rd of May 2020, because it is important, because to the registered participants we will be able to issue certificates at the end of this seminar series. Regarding the way we will communicate with each other, you are more than welcome to use the chat function for networking and commentary. And thanks to Bernard Majaki if I'm right. I don't know how to pronounce it. Hopefully I'm right. From International Federation of Social Workers, who provide us with support for all our sessions. We are able to also have subtitles for our participants available in the case you need them. So thanks, Bernard, for this. Regarding the questions, we would like to ask you to use the question and answer section or function of this Zoom platform. And of course, we would like to ask you to stay muted during the presentations, and of course to be respectful as you are to all presenters and discutants. So for now, I think it's enough of these technical issues. I give the word back to you, Vasilios, to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Sonella. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Reima Maglajlic. Will be delivering this presentation on behalf of other members of the research team, Halida Veizagic, Yasmin Palata, and Dr. China Mills. The presentation focuses on the findings of a co-produced study on the experiences of mental distress caused by political conflict, explored through the lens of MAD studies. Ria, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Vasilios, and for the great pronunciation of Bosnian surnames. So, hello, everyone. As much as Vasilios said, the focus today is on a study which was co-produced a couple of years ago and talking about the continuation of that study, which continues in present day. I will revisit the language of the title because I appreciate that for some that might be eyebrow raising as to why we use this language in research co-production. In order to tell you first a bit more about the context, it's important to kind of learn about this. Recently, it's been 30 years since the start of the siege of Sarajevo, and it's the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina was from 1992 and up to 1996. Worldwide, when conflict happens, and we still witness that today, medicalization happens of the distress caused by war, usually through the label of PTSD as a medical diagnosis for people's distress. Some people find this helpful, but not all do. And Bosnia and Herzegovina is very unique because unlike many other contexts, it has initiated community mental health reform in 1996. That is quite surprising, and it was kind of facilitated for a range of means. Prior to the war, there was mainly the services in mental health were organized, like in many parts of the world, through institutionalized care, whether in hospital psychiatric units or through specialist hospitals inherited from the Austro-Hungarian era, much like throughout the rest of the region. And some of those hospitals were bombed without people in them. And that is one way certainly to initiate a countrywide reform. It was further complex because you could see here on the map what Bosnia and Herzegovina looks like now. And as many say, it's united and divided into two entities and one district based on the US model of Brčko. Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina is further split into 10 cantons. So in order to have mental health legislation, although there is nothing on country level, there needs to be unified legislation if it were to be unified across 13 layers of governance, 2 entities, 1 district, and 10 cantons. And the reason why that reform started was several-fold, and something to maybe touch upon in a separate presentation, primarily because WHO was at the time served by, well, not served, but staffed by Italian doctors. I do apologize if I get slightly delayed or go a bit more. Today I tested positive with COVID, so this is a bit of a kind of extreme sport of presenting, I would say. So I do apologize for that. I'm slightly delayed or foggy. So it's a very interesting process, which kind of built on some inclination for Italian model, which is not that far. Some psychiatrists being educated in Maudsley Hospital, the two lead psychiatrists, Professor Ceric and Noga in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it led to this initiation, and also some wonderful people like colleagues in Ministry of Health in both entities, but particularly Goran Čerkez in Federal Ministry of Health, who supported the development. And here in this image, you see so-called Novo Sarajevo or New Sarajevo, and it houses a primary healthcare center, which serves about 60,000 people. It includes GP services for those who are from UK. It kind of offers primary healthcare services. And across a range of locations, this now also includes community mental health centers. And people don't they don't wear white coats. It's staffed by a psychiatrist, 4 nurses, a psychologist, and a part-time social worker. And there are reasons for that, which we may be able to go through the Q&A later. And really based on kind of conversation, working in the community, and far wider and more accessible services than are present anywhere else, particularly when compared to, for example, the UK, considering how bigger delays there are on community services. And something which is very important in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is to have good coffee, with or without sugar, with lokum and with a cigarette, whatever you may make of that in terms of public health, which is kind of integral to kind of this community gathering to talk about experiences that people have and supporting them and being alongside them. In parallel, there are still some large hospitals of approximately 300 people in some instances, but even more so, the reform was conducted in healthcare, and there are still in social care large-scale institutions which continue. In parallel, I'm originally from Croatia, although I'm Bosnian and Croat Serb, and I heard about this reform starting, and I was fortunate enough in '99 to move over there to support some of the work on the reform of mental health services. And part of the things that I got started with as a social worker is to develop survivor initiatives. One such, there is not that many that survived, there were quite a few. Most of them nowadays include a collaborative kind of associations of professionals and service users, but one still remains, which is completely service user or survivor led. Official translation from Bosnian, which you can see in their insignia here, is Association for Mutual Support in Mental Distress. And they have this wonderful space which they equipped, and they have a beautiful garden around it. They offer drop-ins, they offer different courses, they also offer different employment opportunities where they're possible, and also activities that people want to engage with, such as working the land and making food for them to consume. And on the back of that work, which happened 25 years ago, I started talking particularly to Halida Vezagic, which you will hear a bit later on in person. She unfortunately doesn't speak English, so that's the reason why she's not actually presenting majority of this, but we have recorded a session for you to hear briefly. Halida was taking part on behalf of Mensana at the time. She has long-standing engagement in survivor activism in Bosnia, works on a variety of human rights initiatives as well, and is fairly renowned throughout the region, as well, Southeast European region for it too. And Jasmin Palata from Phoenix in Tuzla, which you can see both towns on the map. And we were lucky enough to work with China Mills, who works in global mental health, to have won the funding from Independent Social Research Foundation. So the study was completely co-produced. Jasmin, Halida and I, with China acting as a critical friend via medium of English, co-produced every element, what questions to ask, what the study is going to be about. And the reason why we refer to madness in the title is because the inspiration really stems from MAD studies. Halida and I were involved in some of the early assessments of community mental health services some 20 odd years ago. But when we and I was doing professional interviews at the time, and Halida was involved in setting questions and talking and doing interviews with people who use community mental health care services. But all the conversations focused on the service. Does this service work well for you? What works well? What needs improving? Everything, the conversation focused on the service rather than what people experienced. And by finding out more about MAD studies, we really wanted to talk about people's lives on their own terms. And it really felt like a missed opportunity to have worked and supported the development of survivor-run initiatives, and not to have I would speak to people informally, but as a researcher, I didn't do that. And so Halida and I are still in touch, both privately and professionally, and we came up with this idea and really wanted to do something like this. And Yasmin from Phoenix was a co-researcher in Tuzla, Halida in Sarajevo, and in total we did 20 interviews, and we managed to, and it was narrative interviews, the two of them conducted with people, and we worked together to develop a interview guide which worked for them. And there was a gender balance achieved. We also wanted to have a wide range of ages, which we succeeded. The participants' age range was from 26 to 70, and majority of them were in their 40s. We wanted also to have a balance between rural people who live in rural areas and urban areas, because there are vast differences in Bosnia, which is a country of some 3 million people. But we only managed to secure 5 of them. And then we met at the beginning to develop the kind of methodology for the study, and we met at the end of the study to kind of collaboratively make sense and analyze all of the data. I do apologize, I had to cough. So here is a brief overview of the findings. And they really stress that while people do still use psychiatric labels to talk about their experiences, they spoke about PTSD and so forth, really they indicate that the social model of distress is very, very important, that their distress had firm roots in what they experienced during the war and gender-based violence, both during the war and afterwards, because in Bosnia, much like we are seeing slowly and hearing about in Ukraine at the moment, and in range of conflicts, gender-based violence, particularly rape, is used as a instrument of war. And their distress was very for everyone. And here you have 2 quotes from Amar, who's a former soldier, and from Aisha, who is a young woman from Sarajevo, that that violence is the cause of their distress. That's the reason why they are, not their biology necessarily, or their lack of resilience. And also poverty. So here is a quote from Josip. Majority of the participants we speak to, spoken to and speak to now in part 2 of the study, which I'll tell you about shortly, live in abject poverty through a range of lack of access to employment, lack of access to meaningful benefits, and a range of life circumstances. And they mainly kind of survive within their community, which was hugely important. Beyond, people really value community mental health care, but when we looked at kind of what supports people, it really is a mixture of things. What was really surprising and positive to hear is just how much support people have from their families, and how much they're meaningful members of their families, and how important it is for them to have support from their peers who have gone and had similar experiences, as well as from their friends in everyday life, as well as mental health practitioners. So it really was a kind of being able of part and being an active part of supportive communities that is crucial to support people. Also that it's mutual. So here is a story of Ilma, a woman in her 40s who was a carer for her mum when she developed cancer. The stories were also, it's a very small pilot, but it indicates that there are gender differences. While men were able to start their own families, women mainly kind of became active parts of their biological families. Importantly, people were really grateful to be listened to and have a say, for somebody to listen to their stories, for them to have a say about their lives. And there were also concerns about when they don't have a say in what's happening. So here we have a quote from Naila, who is worried that she has been hospitalized before, and that her son gets concerned about how well she's doing and hospitalizes her again, and that this usually occurs at the time where it disrupts the rest of her life, and that she really doesn't want to go into a hospital again and that she's listened to, that she's well enough and feels that she has enough support around her for not to need to be hospitalized, which still happens. So in terms of implications for practice, the findings from the pilot suggest the importance of service user or survivor-run initiatives in mental health, depending on the language that feels better and more that you're more committed to use. And also that in parallel to, yes, community mental health services are hugely valued and important, but also it's important to have access to advocacy, human rights-based advocacy, on, for example, convention on the rights of people with disabilities. So to ensure that people wishes and say is adhered to, that they have better say in their lives, and that further abuse is prevented. And non-coercive treatments were found to be the most useful. But the thing that is very frequently neglected is that it's equally important that there is work on poverty mitigation strategies and support in order to ensure that people feel well. So now we're at the stage where in the end of last year, we managed to get some funding from the British Academy. We're furthering the study and doing work across 9 more locations in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We're also looking at the impact of the pandemic because Bosnia and parts of Bosnia also experienced severe flooding in 2014. So looking at kind of extreme events, it really is something that in parts of the country, people had their lives completely disrupted by the war, the flooding, as well as across the country now, the pandemic. Impact of poverty, looking more at gender differences as well as ethnic diversity, because another feature of the pilot was that while we did have a few ethnic Serbs and Croats take part, majority of the participants were Bosniak, and also looking at supporting rural areas and for people who have additional healthcare needs. All of this was very much developed and suggested by Halida, who is now really very proactive. She always has been, but she's now even more proactive as a co-researcher in saying, this is what needs to happen and this is what I want to do. And I'm kind of more and more being converted into an admin support, which is great in terms of research commitment to research co-production. So here you will hear from Halida. The first question doesn't have subtitles. For the rest of it, it really should switch on. If not, I will attempt again. But here you will hear a little bit from Halida in her own words.
Ria, there's no sound. Is it right?
Sorry?
There's no sound.
There's no sound. Okay, so if I mute myself, there is no sound. Sorry, I was coughing, so I muted myself. I do apologize.
Still no sound. At least I cannot hear anything. I don't know, Sanela, can you hear?
Okay, let me try again. I have a plan B just in case. How are we doing for time?
We're okay.
Yeah.
Slightly
Okay.
Right. Yeah. But...
Right. Let's try from here.
Actually,
can you hear this? Can you hear that?
No. But there's somebody, Stacey Moreno suggests that when you share your screen, hit the sound button.
Sorry.
There is a person from the audience saying that when you share your screen, you should be able to see a sound button somewhere.
Sound button. Just the mute button.
It is a setting that it will pop up according to.
Okay. Right. Let's see. Can you hear it now? No. Oh, goodness. It does have subtitles. So just in the interest of having Halida at least some chance.
Yeah, sure.
Let's maybe just observe it that way. I do apologize for that. Let me try and put it further up and see whether that will help. And let me see. Okay. Right, let's see if this will work. I've now selected a different mic. Does this work? No.
But Rea, I think as only us who are native Bosnians can understand her speaking in our language, I think it's also okay not to waste time, and we can,
Okay.
the others can read it in the title.
Okay, so yeah. Just to briefly kind of summarize what happens next. So I'm really sorry that you aren't able to really hear the full story that Halida had to say in her own words. Towards the end, she said, why is it important for people, you know, we discussed briefly, why is it important for her to be the one who is talking to people and is shaping this study? And she says, people are telling me regularly, I'm telling you things that I didn't say to anybody else. So there is something about how we as practitioners try to drag people's experiences and distress into our understandings, as opposed to working with people and starting where they are and listening to how to help them develop agency, particularly after violent political conflict. I'll put the link to the full report, which includes all 20 narratives based on people's wishes, in the chat. And also here is my email, and I'm also happy to facilitate contact with Halida herself. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ria. There's an opportunity for a couple of immediate questions before we move into the next speaker. The first one is really quick to answer. Is when was this recording? When this recording took place? The video you just showed. And the second one, actually, there are two questions around the MUD studies approach and what are the non-coercive mental health interventions. If you could briefly say a few things about these approaches.
Can you repeat the question? My COVID brain is, can you repeat it again, please? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, the first one is about the recording. When did this happen? You know, the timing of the recording.
Okay, oh, sorry. So this recording happened last week. We just recorded each other last week, and one thing which is important to note, which is kind of in between the lines in what Halida said, was the war in Ukraine is really reverberating right throughout Bosnia-Herzegovina and right throughout the region, but particularly so in Bosnia. Halida is currently doing the field work. She visited 2 sites so far as part of the follow-up study, and is really feeling how people are worried about what will happen and the impact of war, and he has kind of brought back the memories of everything that has happened. And then in many ways, which she kind of mentioned at the beginning, the war never really properly ended for many, many people in all kinds of ways, but particularly when it comes to poverty and everything as to how it reverberates. And I think up to an extent, my own, because I studied social work at the beginning of the war, and it really became my lifelong work. And sometimes when we think about this, has been 30 years, first of all, it makes me wonder about my age, but also in terms of just how, it did go from being something we all live with as something which we carry on our backs constantly, and which is constantly trying to tackle us to the floor, to being something we kind of walk alongside with. But I think particularly working alongside people and providing agency for them to become more active and have a say in issues that define their lives is something I think that drives us forward. I hope that answers the question.
Excellent, absolutely. And I think we will have the opportunity to talk a little bit more about the mud studies approach, because it has generated questions and excitement in the chat room. So we will ask this after the next presentation, and Sanela will now present the next speakers.
Thank you, Vasilios, and thank you, Rea, for your wonderful presentation. Looking forward to the discussion later on the several issues, as Vasilios has already mentioned. And I have a pleasure to introduce our next speakers. The second presentation will be given by Professor Jim Campbell from the University College Dublin, and Dr. Joey Duffy from Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland. The topic of their presentation is overcoming barriers and challenges to reconciliation in Northern Ireland, social work approach. I'm really glad that we can learn from their experience. At least for myself, I have to add that their work has been very inspiring for me to somehow put my own work experience in academic terms. So Professor Campbell and Professor Duffy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sanela, and congratulations particularly to Vasilios and Ria for organising the seminar, and the support of the IFSW is wonderful. This is a joint presentation. I will begin with the first half, and then Joe will take over the second half. Just to say that Joe and I have known each other for many years. There are some commonalities in our identities. We've lived through the conflict in Northern Ireland as young people, growing up in the conflict. We are both social work practitioners, and until recently, well, I left Queen's about 10 years ago, but I worked with Joe at Queen's University Belfast for many years. We share those commonalities, but we're a bit different because we would be perceived to be the two different in terms of the two communities that are identified with the conflict in Northern Ireland. So some would see me as a unionist or a nationalist, and Joe as a Catholic, or me a Protestant, Joe a Catholic. That's a very simplistic way of saying things. Okay, Joe, hopefully Joe can you manage the next slide, Joe?
Yeah, okay, Jim.
So the structure of the presentation is as follows. I will briefly talk about the history of the state, the impact of the Troubles on society and social work before 1998, which was a key moment in the history of the conflict, which we'll talk about. And then Joe will use more up-to-date material to talk about 1998 onwards. And you'll see at the end of the presentation, there are an extensive range there's an extensive literature that you can refer to if you want to hear more about this topic. So we'll talk about post-1998, and then you may or may not know, probably do know this by now, that Northern Ireland is the smallest jurisdiction in the United Kingdom. Can everybody hear me? I hope.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, we can, yeah.
It was established in 1921 when Ireland was partitioned. There's a long history of colonialism in the Irish context, going back perhaps 500, 600, 800 years ago. But the moment of the way the state was created, the jurisdiction was created, was the very important moment 100 years ago. And so the Northern Ireland state remained within the United Kingdom, and the Republic became eventually independent. So the effect of this was to have a complex set of characteristics within the state, not unlike, I think, Bosnia-Herzegovina, where there were different ethnic or cultural or religious minorities not at one against each other. Some saw themselves as Irish, others as British. Thanks, Joe. And this is just where Northern Ireland is. It's a small 1.8 million people, just in the periphery of Europe and on the periphery of the United Kingdom. Thanks, Joe. Around 1.9 million people, a very small place. It's had the current conflict has lasted 40 years, but as I said earlier, it goes way, way back in the 15th century. Around 3,700 people have died, and tens of thousands physically and psychologically traumatized. It's got an interesting system of health and social welfare. In 1973, whenever the British state took over the administration of the jurisdiction, it introduced an integrated system of health and social welfare. It has strong community and voluntary sectors and a very regulated top-down sense of welfare bureaucracies. So if British people looking across the water to Northern Ireland would look at social work and healthcare, they would look at the administration as being quite solid, quite efficient and effective. So we're quite good at doing the bureaucratic things. The one thing we're not very good at is understanding the conflict and our role in the conflict. So the current conflict started around 1969 and has lasted since. As I said, the British government took over in 1972, and Northern Ireland did not govern itself until the key moment of peace building, which is called the Belfast Agreement. But even since 1998, and Joe will speak to this, we've had intermittent political administrations. Often the conflict has impacted upon politics, and at times the warring parties can't get on with each other and the British state takes over. And there's a recent example of that in recent years. So it's very complicated. Every area of political conflict is complex and we can't generalize. So we have our own stories about Northern Ireland, and it's a very differentiated experience depending on who you are, how you see the conflict, how you've lived in the conflict. And these are two rather dramatic examples of how we can understand the conflict. On the left is an incident called Bloody Sunday, which happened actually 50 years ago. There was a 50-year anniversary where the state killed 13 people, unarmed citizens, and injured many others. And so the legacy of that has been very profound in the history of the state of Northern Ireland. The issue about that incident was that the state killed its citizens. So when the caregivers kill its own people, that's got a profound impact, a traumatic impact on society. And then the other representation of the conflict is the Omagh bombing, which happened just at the time of peace building. Ironically, it was the biggest level of death and injury that occurred during this whole period of the Troubles. But the issue about that was it was carried out by a paramilitary group. So depending on how you view these experiences or these incidents, how you're brought up in Northern Ireland will determine how you view the conflict. And in similar ways, there have been differentiated approaches by social workers to the conflict. And in the literature that we've referenced at the end of the presentation, these are some suggested phases in the social work response to the conflict. up to 1969, before the start of the Troubles, it was a fairly sleepy sort of provincial part of the United Kingdom. There was underlying sectarianism, but until the Troubles erupted, we were looked upon as essentially a British health and social care system. When the Troubles erupted in 1969, 1972, 500 people were killed, and that's a big number of people in such a small place. And no one could do much about it. Civil society collapsed, the political system collapsed, and there was sectarian and other types of violence consistently every day and every night in Northern Ireland. And health and social care professions couldn't really respond. They weren't equipped in any way. They had no history of living and doing something in this situation. So they did what they could. And as Joel said in a little bit in his presentation, we have still a legacy of that period where social workers worked in very traumatic situations and still carry the trauma with them to this day. And then there was a period from 1973 at the start of what we call direct rule, when the British state took over, until the moment of peace building, the Belfast Agreement in 1998, when social work delivered what we call a period of technocratic type of service, very professional, very well trained workforce at qualifying and post-qualifying levels. And gradually, as the decades moved on, social workers were more prepared or more equipped to begin to think about the impact of the Troubles on their own identities, their own professionalism, but most importantly, the impact on their clients. Yes, so that's my bit, Joel.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Jim, and hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. We're delighted to be involved in this initiative. My focus in the second bit of our presentation is to look at the response of social work education, and then just to summarize a piece of research that we were involved in over a 2-year period, looking at the perspectives of social workers who were in the front line during this period of what's been euphemistically referred to as the Troubles. So I suppose peace coming around with the peace agreement in 1998, social work education up until then really didn't directly confront these issues in the curriculum. In terms of the content of social work education programs, in many ways it mirrored that sense of what Jim and colleagues have referred to in the literature as a sense of benign detachment. These topics really weren't confronted in the social work education curriculum. So we had social workers actually working in the front line, and they were completely ill-equipped to do so because there were no opportunities in the classroom to openly discuss these really contested and these really challenging issues. Interestingly, in Northern Ireland, as in other parts of the UK as well, social work education was reformed in 2003. The introduction of a generic degree in social work. So that's just a couple of years after the signing of the peace agreement. And I think as a reflection of this sort of more peaceful societal milieu that we found ourselves in, our regulator, the Northern Ireland Social Care Council, wanted to see social work education, I suppose, getting off the fence, which is where we felt we were up until then, to actually directly confronting these issues in the classroom. And they referred to these issues as the Northern Ireland context. And they stipulated in this new qualification that they wanted the impact of the Troubles on individuals, groups, and communities to be directly addressed in the curriculum. And running parallel with that, there was also a new initiative brought around in social work education across the UK as well, that there would be service user involvement in the social work education experience for students. So one of the initiatives that Jim and myself and others worked on was a really interesting collaboration with a large NGO called WAVE, which is an organization that supports people directly impacted by the Troubles, people that have been bereaved, injured, and traumatized. And that's very significant because Northern Ireland has got one of the highest rates of PTSD in the world, and significant numbers of people who are suffering from mental ill health directly related to the Troubles. So this is an organisation that we were working very closely with, who would come in and teach directly our students based on their lived experience of living with these challenges in terms of how they affected them at an individual level, their experience of loss, their experience of coping with trauma, and their experiences of families. So in many ways, this was directly addressing that Northern Ireland context that our regulator was nudging us towards in terms of this, these revisions in the curriculum. So what it looked like was that we would have a series of lectures over 2 weeks. So we would look at social work and sectarianism, confronting that, what has been referred to as the elephant in the room, that old cliche. We were confronting this directly. The historical perspectives on the Troubles, policy perspectives, and also looking at trauma aspects of epigenetics, transgenerational trauma, intergenerational trauma, and equally where social workers found themselves in the front line during this really difficult period. And then in the afternoons, our wave colleagues, our wave service users, citizen educators would directly share their lived experience of the Troubles with the students. Now, in many ways, you could argue that this is not for the pedagogically faint-hearted. In many ways, it's creative pedagogy, but at the same time, it comes with a lot of ethical, possible ethical issues, and the ethic of care really circumvented the way in which we approach this, because in Northern Ireland, arguably, we've got peace without reconciliation. Some commentators would say that there's still this veneer of consensus and that we still aren't truly post-conflict, but that arguably we are pre-post-conflict. So there are still issues and risks attached to people sharing their direct lived experiences. There are also ethical issues about the age group of the students. Many of the students, because we're very young in the period of 1998, and arguably we were introducing students through this pedagogy to a very difficult narrative, very difficult sets of experiences that they had no experiential context in terms of relating to it. However, when we looked at the evaluation, that this initiative as well, I should have said, was funded by the European Union, by the Peace 3 initiative then. And we evaluated this teaching over many years. And here's just a snapshot of some of the comments from the students. There was a sense of relief actually expressed as well by the students that we were confronting these topics in this very direct way. And you can see here from some of these quotes, the students actually picked up on the sort of emotional magnitude, the emotional temperature in the classroom, actually feeling the experience in terms of the sharing of those personal narratives. I think this is a good thing to be taught about, as it was important to address it and not sideline it. This is the reality. Another quote from a student. And the students were also talking about actively engaging, increasing their understanding of victims and survivors issues in Northern Ireland, being critical to learning and understanding of empathy. And obviously we're still living in a society in Northern Ireland with the legacy issues associated with the Troubles, very high rates of suicide, very high rates of addictions, very high rates of mental ill health directly related to the Troubles, and very high rates of PTSD. So it's really important that the students are exposed to this narrative during their training, because these are the types of issues that they need to be able to feel skilled to deal with when they qualify. In terms of, we were feeling as well, Jim and myself, we've known each other many years, and we both worked during this very difficult time. But there was a feeling as well, before we did this piece of work, that there were stories out there that social workers wanted to share and wanted to talk about in terms of how they coped during this really, really difficult time in our recent history. And because of that, you know, we were supported in this project by the British Association of Social Workers, the Northern Ireland branch of BASWA, and the Northern Ireland Social Care Council, our regulator, actually try and gather the stories of social workers during the period 1968 right up to 1969, the start of the Troubles. So what we did was we got 102 social workers to fill in a confidential online survey. And then through a purposive sampling, we interviewed, through semi-structured interviews, a range of social workers, 28 with lived experience of working through the Troubles, and ethical approval was granted by the University of Northern, by Queen's. We were also working with one of our research partners was based at New York University, and then we had ethical approval from right across the statutory sector in Northern Ireland. And this was a piece of research with quite a high level, quite a high emotional tariff. We felt it was really important in this research to focus primarily on social workers' professional experiences, although admittedly, it's very difficult to actually focus entirely on professional experiences without entering into people's professional experiences as well. Jim and myself were directly involved in doing the interviews, along with Carol Tasson, one of our other co-investigators. And our sense was that people, the social workers we interviewed, really wanted to talk. It was almost like they experienced a sense of relief that all of these experiences that they had been harnessing for over 30 years, there was now an opportunity to tell their stories, even though the telling of these stories of themselves were very distressing. And when you look at this graph here, it gives you some idea of how much adversity social workers experienced through bomb scares and roadblocks, sectarian abuse, shootings and bombing. This was just part of the backdrop to their day-to-day professional practice. Time and time again, Jim and myself heard the expression, "We just got on with it, we just did our jobs." And what we found was that the sort of unquestioning adherence to the social work value base, i.e. putting the needs and interests of the service user, the social work clients, always came first. But at the same time, that came at a great risk. There were 62% of our respondents talked about feeling at risk in going about their jobs day and daily. So if you can imagine how that must have felt like, getting up to go out to your work every day, feeling that I'm feeling very nervous and I'm feeling at risk in terms of what I may encounter. There were incredible stories of bravery where people literally put their lives on the line, but at the same time, this came at great cost to a number of people who had death threats made against them, and those death threats, to this day, some of them, they still remain. So those are the types of challenges that our colleagues here in Northern Ireland were dealing with on a day and daily basis. That was the fabric, the very dysfunctional fabric, arguably, that the professional context of social work occurred within, yet at the same time, very creative and imaginative professional responses were uncovered, and really creative alliances were formed with communities. And social workers were ethically and morally challenged as well in terms of some of the negotiations, some of the people they had to negotiate with. So in many ways, whilst this research was focusing in a period of our history that was very disruptive and very violent and very negative, in many ways, the social work shone through in terms of the adherence to the professional value base of the profession that really enabled our colleagues to navigate a way through this societal mayhem that formed the backdrop to their work. some of, again, the everyday challenges in the response, these bomb scares, roadblocks, shootings, bombings. This is not what we want to envisage or anticipate when we're going about our jobs, helping people with mental health issues, disabled people, people with learning disability, children and families. Yet at the same time, social workers navigated their way around this. The level of support that they got from their managers was questionable and variable, but at the same time, their managers were also struggling with this, with how to actually cope with these real challenges in society, because there was no rule book, there was no context for this. And as I said earlier, there was no sort of predisposing educational focus that these social workers had been prepped for in terms of undertaking this very challenging work. So the way in which they got support was through their teams, yet the conceptual ambiguity there is the fact that there was no talking openly about how the troubles were impacting them on a personal and professional level. But ironically, they were able to support each other within that, yet not talk openly about how the issues were adversely impacting them. So there is a particular irony within that of itself. I've included here some of the reflections that Jim and myself got in the surveys and also in the questionnaires or the interviews that we did. And people talking about how it's only when you think back how crazy those times were, being in places with people which were totally unsafe, and this sense of immunity to things happening around them. No one flinching when all these bombs were going off or shootings could be heard, making plans to visit people when the city was gridlocked with bomb scares. But the mindset of delivering the service was ingrained. And again, that's something that as a profession we should feel proud of during these times of adversity, because we were working alongside people that were like us. We took enormous risks with our personal safety, and it's only on reflection that you realize just how dangerous that was. But as I said earlier, this did come at a cost to our colleagues, and this final quote here alludes to that. Anybody who worked or lived here, I don't believe anyone who worked or lived here escaped that legacy of the troubles on their psyche, their outlook, and their ability to recognize and deal with conflict. We still don't have any mechanisms to offload this backstory, the bad, but also the good parts. Working through and living this period in our past has made me a much more resilient person. However, only a fool would not acknowledge this came at a cost, and I'm sure this has repercussions even today, so many years later. In terms of our conclusions, we found that social workers in Northern Ireland have been exposed to very high levels of multiple adversities through the Troubles. There was still a sense of detachment from the wider violent and political milieu, but that of itself is not something to criticise our colleagues for. That actually was an important way for coping for social workers to remain detached, yet at the same time, get that parallel support from each other. In most cases, employers didn't openly engage with or recognise those challenges, but in many ways that mirrored the sort of frontline social workers' resilience and determination. Let's just get on with it. We have a job to do. Social workers in Northern Ireland got considerable support from each other to cope and survive those difficult times. And now social work practice and education must address the deep legacy of Northern Ireland's political conflict. We strongly feel there's still work to be done. I think Jim is going to come in now and just talk to the last two slides in terms of where we feel social work needs to go to next. So over to you.
Thanks
Jim.
very much, Joe. I noticed some questions are coming in, and we don't want to take too much of everyone's time because there will be questions for Ria as well. But really, we just want to look to the future. You know, since maybe in the last decade, it feels a safer place to work, even though there are substantial legacies in the society that we live in. Sectarianism is an obvious legacy issue that we all consistently deal with. So there are new improved opportunities for working with communities. Legacy issues will continue, but the state is trying to deal with some aspects of reconciliation, truth and recognition. And there are new sets of relationships, particularly with service user organizations, which Joe has taken the lead within over the last 10 years. And of course, this sort of a space here today is wonderful for us because we have consistently believed that only a sort of narrow view, national view about social work and political conflict or regional view won't answer all the questions, not only some of them, and that we need to learn from each other. And we've particularly learned over the years from our colleagues in the room here, Sanella, Vasilios and Reima and others. And that's something we would like to continue and encourage.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jim and Joe. Joe, can you please stop sharing the screen so we can see all participants? Excellent, wonderful. There is a number of questions, and we can start with immediate questions that refer to the specific research you just presented. There is a question asking if there is any research on the impact, professional and psychological impact, the troubles had on social work practitioners.
Jim, you did some work in mental health practitioners.
Yeah, well,
2005.
Yeah, but it wasn't, in terms of psychological impact, it wasn't using measures, psychological measures. So I think there is a bit of work to be done there if we wanted to be that type of research. But I did an early, I was involved in an early survey of mental health social work. It's a bit like the one that Joe has just described, but we haven't measured trauma. And despite the fact that we have lots of experience of trauma, there haven't been too many attempts to understand the experience of any professionals, let alone social workers.
There's another very good question in there as well. Did the research find out if those brave practitioners contemplated abandoning the profession? Interestingly, what we found was that social workers were very reluctant to take any time off work. They and also were quite, during the sort of ferocity when things were at their worst, they also were quite reluctant to take leave. There was a sense that they didn't want to leave their colleagues unsupported. So there really was a sense of being in there together and looking out for each other and supporting each other, even though there was this sort of vacuum of not getting really the level of support they needed from the system.
Excellent, thank you. Sanella.
Thank you, Vasilios. I would not like to abuse my position of a co-presenter, but I just have one urgent need to comment on James and Joe's presentation because it invoked a lot of thinking, and I was all the time comparing the situation that we face here, and I think I can speak in the name of all of us, saying thank you, Jim and Joe, for this valuable and very important insights on how social work can contribute to reconciliation, which is a completely different approach that has been used in most of the post-conflict societies, which was top-down and which, at least in the Bosnian case, has clearly failed. We are even 30 years later, we are a highly divided society across every line. And I'm really very happy about this, about how your research translates into changes to social work curricula and to social work education, because in our context, we continue, even though we knew from experience about the devastating consequences of war and trauma on professionals, on academics, on social work students. In social work curricula, we continued as nothing has happened. It was only recently that I tried in the past year to introduce in courses that I teach survivors' perspective, starting with war veterans, to somehow dismantle these motives to join the war, which is regularly seen in the media, and lately with a population which is so voiceless and not even acknowledged in our society, and that is children born out of the war, children born by mothers who were raped or experienced sexual violence. But it is just it is not systematic, it is not institutional, it is just a kind of volunteering project supported by civil society organizations and survivors organizations to tackle these issues within social work curricula. So I just needed to make this remark. Thank you, Vasilios. I hope there is still time for our participants to ask questions.
Adela, you're the co-host. You don't have to ask for permission. You know. There's another question I would ask all three presenters, starting from Ria. Dimitri is asking, what are some of the barriers you experienced while conducting this research, or the pedagogical aspect of your activity? Ria first.
Just make another side comment. Jim was the first social work academic to organize a meeting of social work academics on political conflict some 22 years ago in Belfast. And that really is the origin point of all the work today, including this seminar. And I think it's very, very important to say that, which I can't thank you enough, Jim, for. So just that side, very important, I think, side note. In terms of barriers for our research, I think the question is mainly aimed at Joe and Jim, but our challenges were very colonial and stemmed from UK universities, and that is that the payments for our Bosnian colleagues were delayed severely, and this was seen as a small budget study that isn't that very important, and if there is a couple of months delay, it doesn't matter that much. We have tried to address this as successfully as possible in this. And also getting ethical approval for some of the work that we are currently doing, such as we want to develop social media profile with all the stories around people's experiences, and people really want, and this is something akin to MAT studies, which is not professional safeguarding people's stories and kind of polishing them and presenting them in a particular way, but facilitating people's agency and involvement on their own terms. And in terms of ethics, particularly British ethics, that can be perceived as challenging. And they're saying, no, absolutely not. You can't put people's stories under names, but it's their stories, it's their experiences, and they do have mental capacity and agency to make those decisions. So those are some of the recent challenges that we have had, but I'll pass over to Joe and Jim because I know we're tight for time.
Maybe just quickly, Joe, and you're much better on the ethics stuff than me because you led the study. One thing someone asked, should you go and see Belfast, the movie? Yeah. I think you should. It captures, it's a slightly romanticized artistic view, but it does capture a moment in 1969, and and the music's very good as well.
Yeah.
And secondly, Van Morrison, who is from Belfast. But the other thing is, I think one of the impediments is something which is hard to grasp. It's the impediments of the mind. If people have grown up in the society, and all the social workers in Northern Ireland, nearly all are born and brought up and sectarianized by the conflict. To get things moving, it's in the mind as much as actually bricks and mortar or the business about organizations. That all is created by the way people think, and it's a bit of a attitude, but if we can change the way people think through pedagogy and research, that's the way to go. Joe knows all about the nitty-gritty of the difficulties that we encountered, Joe.
Yeah, the ethical side of it was very challenging. I think it probably took a couple of years, maybe a year, Jim, for us to get, rightly so. Also, we were doing this research at a time when the General Data Protection, GDPR, was being introduced. So we had to have even higher levels of integrity in terms of privacy and protection of information reflected in our research. But one of the challenges that Jim and myself have found over the years as well is transferring the sort of innovative work that we do in the university out into practice. Because in many ways, the social work students, when they graduate and when they qualify and when they go into practice learning, what we need to see is sort of the pedagogical bravery in many ways being mirrored and that there is a willingness to confront these issues. And I think maybe, Jim, there's still a residue of the sort of reluctance to engage with these issues in an open way, even though our colleagues were engaging with massive levels of societal adversity in the way they did their work, but they still sat on the fence to an extent in regard to these more difficult conversations. And that's something we find in other parts of the world as well, that sense of political detachment whenever conflict forms the political backdrop. So I think there's still a bit of work to be done at a structural level, moving away from the micro. I mean, there are some individuals who will be very brave about this and who will confront these issues, but I think there's still work to be done on that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Joe and Jim. Ria, I'd like to ask you a question. I mentioned this before. It was one of the immediate questions about mud studies approaches. And how can they be applied in this specific context? I know this could be a topic of a whole lecture.
Yeah.
But we have 5 minutes.
Math studies, I think that there is a range of resources which are available if you look them up. There was recently a Routledge handbook of International Handbook of Math Studies, which was published. It really is something stemming from so-called survivor movement in mental health, exploring alternatives to understanding in mental health. And if you look up research on mental health and political conflict, all of them are heavily psychiatrized, and all of them rely on that understanding. And if I may just very, very briefly to make a comment. Somebody said education never prepares you for these things, and why didn't we learn this? Education will never fully prepare you for everything you will encounter in practice. This is why continuing professional development is important, not just with these seminars. Nobody prepared me to work in the war. I was studying in the middle of the war. War only entered the classroom once when there was a siren, we had to evacuate, and that says something. I think we need to be more proactive about listening to people and engaging with people's experiences to find new ways of working and find colleagues with which we can explore that, because not all education can prepare us for every situation we will encounter during our long careers. I hope it's okay to kind of make that intervention. And for border thinking, look up work of Mignolo. It comes from decolonial thinking to challenge and look at the borders and outside colonial understandings, what sits outside the understanding of psychiatry and of the West as to what conflict and distress is. I'll stop there.
Exactly. No, I think that there is time for one quick question, because it was my question as well. And I can see that this is being discussed in the chat room. What kind of support were there for social workers in this context, in Ireland or in Bosnia? And given that you mentioned, I remember that you mentioned that there was limited support. What kind of support should we be demanding for, sadly, in current and future conflicts? Who would like to start answering these?
Good supervision. Good supervision.
Briefly, in our experience, I think the trades unions have been strong in Northern Ireland. They offer a middle ground fixed in between sectarianism. So we have trade union organizations that have been very good, and they've incorporated social work as well as other public sector workers. And I have to say that BASWA have been very good, Joe, I feel, in the years, particularly around our projects, that they've embraced it, and they've come, they've realized that that's very much part of their role as other parts of the function of a professional organization.
I think Ray as well has touched on it, good supervision. I mean, that's something that we found in our research really helped social workers support them through. And I mean, there's a question in the Q&A as well about the difficulties that social workers must be facing currently in Ukraine. And, if anything, what we found in Northern Ireland was the importance of supporting each other, but equally the time, as you said, you were alluding to, Ray, to sit down with another colleague to actually talk through the challenges and the worries and the fears that you're encountering as you go out as you leave your home in the morning to do your job.
Excellent. Yeah, please.
No, we have to support each other. Also, I'll put in the chat, you are not paying, we're not asking for any payment for the series, but IFSW has recently published a call of support for Ukraine. So please if possible, do support their work there. I hope that's okay.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Actually, thank you all for, the speakers first, for two really powerful presentations, very informative, very important, and really powerful presentations. And also the participants. Again, this is the third session, really well attended, well over 250 participants today from all over the world, asking really interesting and important questions. Before I close, I'd like to answer a technical question. Some of the participants asked about registration and certificates of attendance. If people attended 4 out of 6 sessions, they will be given a certificate of attendance. And you don't have to send us the email, because when you register, I think that you use your email anyway. So we have those details, and we will be in touch after the end of the course. So once again, thank you very much for attending tonight's session. The next one is due to take place on the 19th of April. That's next week, next Tuesday. And the topic will be on peace building, reconciliation, and social work. So we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Lovely to see you.